Why did the yard fall silent the moment she stepped forward? Dust swirled in the late afternoon sun, drifting like smoke around the boots of recruits who suddenly forgot to move. The air was thick with sweat, gravel crunching beneath restless feet, but all eyes turned toward her. The weight across her shoulder looked impossible, a .50 cal, a weapon few could carry with ease, yet she balanced it like it was an extension of her own spine. Some looked at her with a flicker of respect, but most with the same expression she had grown used to, disbelief. A quiet scoff here, a raised brow there. For years, whispers had clung to her like shadows. She was too fragile, too soft-spoken, too quiet to belong in the brutal rhythm of soldiering. And still she walked. Each step forward carried the kind of calm that unsettled people. She didn't glance at them, didn't answer the whispers. She had learned that silence said more than arguments ever could. Yet even in silence, her chest carried a storm. What if they were right? The question lived inside her. It had followed her through every firing range, every training exercise, every cold dawn where her body trembled with exhaustion. Too fragile, too quiet. The words had a way of digging into her skin until they felt carved there. And yet there she stood. The recruits stiffened as a commanding shadow fell across the yard. The general. He walked with the slow rhythm of someone who knew the world bent around his presence. His chest glittered with medals, not tokens of vanity, but of decades survived. His boots struck gravel with sharp authority, each step demanding silence even though the yard was already hushed. He passed the first line of recruits without pause. A flicker of eyes here, a curt nod there. He didn't need to speak. His silence was its own language. And then he came to her. At first he barely looked. Just another face in the endless line of hopeful soldiers, just another uniform. But then his gaze flicked downward to her vest. The badge. Not an ordinary badge. This one was etched with numbers. 3,200 meters. He froze. His boots stopped mid-crunch, one foot hanging in the air longer than it should have, then slowly grounding into the gravel. The general's eyes narrowed. His hand twitched as though reaching for something he hadn't touched in years. The entire yard seemed to stop breathing. Recruits exchanged glances, confused. Why had the general halted? Why, after decades of discipline and ritual, would he stumble over one small soldier standing so still? Her chest tightened. To her, those seconds stretched into eternity. She remembered. The mountains, the night wind, the feeling of ice gnawing through layers of fabric until her bones trembled. Her hands had shook so violently she thought she might never hold steady again. But when her cheek rested against the cold steel, the world stilled. The rifle, massive and unyielding, had become her anchor. The target was impossibly far. No one attempted such shots, not under those conditions, not with the wind screaming through the valleys, not with the weight of an entire unit depending on one pull of a trigger. But she had, and she hadn't missed. She remembered the silence that followed, not triumph, not the cheer of victory, just silence. A silence heavier than any battlefield noise she had ever heard. She had ended a life across a distance most couldn't even comprehend. She had saved others by doing it, but the cost, she carried that alone. Now the general's eyes locked on the small glint of steel pinned to her chest. His lips moved, quiet at first, almost a whisper. 3,200. The words carried like gunfire in the still air. A murmur rippled through the recruits. Some scoffed, dismissing it as a mistake. Others widened their eyes as if they were looking at her for the first time. Her pulse pounded, but she said nothing. Silence was her armor. Boasting never protected anyone. The general's hand hovered, fingers reaching toward the badge as if it were something fragile, almost untouchable. But he didn't make contact. Instead, his expression shifted. Hard lines softened. For a brief second, too brief for anyone but her to notice, he looked less like a general and more like a man who remembered. He had commanded thousands. He had witnessed bravery in its loudest and in its quietest forms. But here, standing in front of him, was something he rarely saw. Not noise, not pride, just the quiet burden of someone who had carried more than her share. The recruits leaned forward, waiting. Was this the moment she would be exposed? Would the general strip her of the honor she had no right to claim, as so many believed? Her throat burned. She kept her eyes locked forward, though doubt gnawed at her chest. But the general did not accuse her. He turned instead to the yard. His voice, when it came, was steady, deliberate. "You measure strength," he said, "by noise, by who shouts the loudest, by who carries the heaviest load, but real strength," he gestured toward her, "is carried in silence, in choices no one ever wants to make." A stillness heavier than any drill or command settled over the recruits. No whispers now, no nervous laughter, just silence as the truth hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Her gaze dropped, unsure whether this was recognition or judgment. She braced for both. Then it happened. The general saluted. Slow, deliberate, unwavering. It was not the salute of hierarchy, not a routine gesture demanded by rank. It was something rarer. Respect. The recruits erupted, not in chaos but in thunderous applause, raw and unpracticed. They weren't clapping for a story they knew. They were clapping for a truth they suddenly understood. For the first time in years, she wasn't the shadow at the edge of the ranks. She was the center. Her chest ached, a crack in the armor she had built over years of silence. For so long she had believed she could live without recognition, that carrying the burden alone was enough. But in that single act something shifted. Not pride, not validation, something softer, something she couldn't yet name. Respect isn't handed down by rank. It's earned in silence, through choices no one sees, through scars no one forgets. And sometimes, the quietest warrior is the one who changes the entire room. Because courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, steady as a trigger pull across 3,000 meters of doubt. She stood there surrounded by applause, and yet, inside she wasn't sure. Had they truly seen her, or had they only seen the badge? That question would follow her long after the yard emptied. And it would not leave her alone. Why did she stay when so many tried to drive her out? The barracks were never quiet, not really. Voices echoed down the metal halls, laughter bouncing off concrete walls, arguments rising sharp as the clang of rifles during inspection. But for her, it was always a different sound that cut the deepest, the whispers. She won't last a month. She's book smart, not field ready. Just a quota fill, a symbol. They thought she didn't hear, but she always did. At night, when the lights dimmed and the air filled with the low hum of snoring, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. She replayed every word spoken behind her back, each syllable grinding like sand in her chest. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them shut up, but she didn't. Silence had always been her weapon, and her curse. During training, silence made her invisible. Instructors overlooked her. Teammates doubted her. No one volunteered to pair with her during drills because silence wasn't what they trusted in combat. They wanted noise, loud confidence, barked orders, bravado. But she stayed. Every dawn, when the whistle split the air, she rose before the others. Her boots hit the dirt before their alarms even sounded. She carried packs heavier than her frame should have borne. She ran miles past exhaustion, her lungs screaming, her legs trembling. And still she ran. It wasn't just survival, it was defiance. On the range, she found her rhythm. While others cracked jokes or cursed under their breath when they missed, she barely moved. She lined up, adjusted her scope, breathed out, and fired. Her shots didn't ring with triumph. They rang with inevitability. But even then, it wasn't enough. Her instructors saw her skill, but not her. They scribbled notes on clipboards, muttered about potential, then moved on. She didn't fit their mold. Soldiers were supposed to bark, to command, to radiate presence. She radiated stillness. And stillness unnerved people. One winter morning, they pushed her harder than the rest. A forced march through sleet and mud, packs overloaded, weapons carried high through knee-deep freezing water. She stumbled more than once, her body shuddering from the cold. One recruit laughed when she fell. Another muttered, "Told you she'd break." But she didn't break. She kept walking, step after agonizing step, mud sucking at her boots, water biting her skin until it burned. She moved without a word, even as her lips turned blue, even as her vision blurred. By the time they reached the checkpoint, half the platoon collapsed. She stood, barely, but she stood. The instructors said nothing. No praise, no recognition, just a nod, the kind of nod given to someone who hadn't failed but hadn't impressed either. Later in the showers, she pressed her forehead against the cold tile, trembling with exhaustion. She wanted to cry, not because of the pain, she could endure that, but because no matter how far she pushed, it never seemed to matter. No one saw her. And yet, part of her wondered if that invisibility was exactly what she needed. Weeks bled into months. Each day, the same whispers followed her, but something strange began to happen. They started to change. Not because the voices grew kinder, but because slowly, silently, her record began to eclipse theirs. On the obstacle course, she climbed faster. On the endurance runs, she lasted longer. On the firing line, her groups tightened until her instructors had nothing to mark in red. Still, she didn't speak. She let the silence say what words never could. There was one instructor, older, the kind who had seen real combat. He never joined in the whispering, never dismissed her. One evening, as the recruits packed away rifles, he lingered. "You know why they doubt you?" he asked, his voice rough. She froze, unsure if it was a trap. "Because you remind them of themselves," he continued. "The parts they don't want to admit exist. Fear, doubt, fragility. You don't bury yours under noise, you carry it. That scares them." He walked away before she could answer. His words stayed. The training never got easier, but she did. Through blistered hands and sleepless nights, through cold that cracked her skin, through hunger that twisted her stomach, she carried on. Alone, always alone. Until the day came when they handed her the rifle that would change everything. The others groaned under its weight, muscles straining as they tried to balance the massive weapon. She didn't. Not because it was light, it never was, but because something about it felt right. Heavy, yes. Brutal, yes, but steady. Anchored. The first time she pulled its trigger, the recoil nearly knocked her flat. She steadied, adjusted, fired again. The instructors raised brows, whispered to each other. She ignored them. What she felt wasn't triumph, it was belonging. For the first time, she wasn't just carrying a weapon, she was carrying herself. But with belonging came weight. And that weight would follow her to the mountains, where silence wasn't just her choice, it was survival. Where the shot that no one believed possible would carve her place into history. And where she would discover that the heaviest burdens aren't carried on your back. They're carried in your chest. How far can one choice echo? The mountains had a way of swallowing sound. Even boots crunching over frozen rock seemed muted, like the earth itself refused to carry noise. The air was thinner up here, cutting cold, turning every breath into mist that vanished before it could settle. She moved with her unit, a small team picked for reconnaissance. Their orders were simple on paper: observe, report, and if the opportunity arose, disrupt. Simple until the map turned to terrain, until the reality of jagged cliffs and shifting winds set in. She carried no one said much about it. No one needed to. The others cast looks when they thought she wasn't watching, as though waiting for her to fail beneath its weight. But she didn't stumble, not once. By the third night, fatigue had gnawed through the team. Their food ration packs were nearly frozen before they could eat them. The wind scraped against their skin until it felt like knives dragging across bone. She wrapped her scarf higher across her face, eyes narrowed against the sting, and kept moving. When the call came through the radio, their world shifted. High-value target, confirmed movement through the valley. Window of opportunity, minutes, not hours. The team stopped, eyes turned. They were too far. Everyone knew it. Even with scopes, even with training, no one attempted shots across valleys like this. The winds were brutal, swirling unpredictably, carrying snow one moment and dead air the next. She didn't move at first, not because she hesitated, but because hesitation was what they expected. The team leader cursed under his breath. "We'll never close the distance in time. Not through this terrain. It's a lost opportunity." Her fingers tightened on the strap. She stepped forward, maybe not. The others blinked. Some laughed, short, disbelieving bursts of sound that vanished quickly in the wind. The leader's gaze sharpened. "You think you can make that shot?" She didn't answer. She simply began to set up. They dug into the rock as she laid prone, adjusting her body until the cold granite pressed against her ribs. Her fingers were numb, her breath misting over the scope. She adjusted, then adjusted again. Every detail mattered: the angle of the wind, the bite of the cold, the flicker of movement far below. The target was barely more than a speck in the distance, over 3 kilometers away. Impossible. Her hands trembled as they always did in the cold. She steadied them against the rifle, letting the weight of the weapon pin her to the earth. Her heart hammered in her chest, louder than any battlefield noise. She thought of the whispers, the laughter, the doubt. She thought of the silence she had carried through every mile of training. And then she let it all go. The world narrowed to a single breath, a single trigger, a single speck moving in the valley below. She exhaled slowly and pulled. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, jarring her bones. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing. Then the sound reached them, faint, delayed by distance, the crack of impact. The speck in the valley crumpled. The radio confirmed seconds later. "Target down, repeat, target down." No cheers followed. No applause. The team exchanged stunned looks, but none spoke. The leader's eyes lingered on her, searching for something: explanation, disbelief, maybe even fear. She lowered her rifle. Her breath fogged the scope, blurring her vision. Silence. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't pride. It was heavier than that. The kind of silence that pressed on her chest until she could hardly breathe. A life had ended because she did not miss. Others would live because she had not faltered. But that didn't make the silence any easier to bear. The march back down the mountains felt longer than the climb up. No one spoke to her. They glanced her way and quickly looked elsewhere, as though the act of seeing her was dangerous. She didn't mind. She had never needed their words. But inside, a storm churned. She had done what no one else would even attempt. She had proven herself in the most undeniable way possible. And yet, she felt smaller. At the debriefing, officers spoke of success, of mission accomplished, of lives saved. They scribbled numbers into reports, assigning value to what she had done. But they didn't see her. Not really. That night, in the dim glow of a bare bulb swinging overhead, she sat alone, cleaning the... Her hands moved methodically, piece by piece, until the weapon gleamed under the light. She paused once, staring at her reflection warped across the steel. Who was she now? A soldier. A savior. A shadow. The silence had no answer. She returned to her unit, but something had shifted. Whispers followed her still, though different now. No one doubted her aim, but some doubted her humanity. "Anyone who can pull a shot like that, they're not like us." She didn't correct them. Maybe they were right. Weeks passed. Missions blurred together. But nothing erased the moment in the mountains, the moment when silence became her companion in a way it never had before. And when she finally returned to the training yard, when she stood with that badge pinned to her chest. She carried all of it, the wind, the distance, the silence, like an invisible weight no one else could feel. That was why the general froze. Because he saw what no one else dared to see. Not the badge, not the number etched in steel, but the silence behind her eyes. Why was it harder to come home than to take the shot? The plane touched down at a quiet airstrip, far from the fanfare of decorated returns. There were no cameras, no flags, no waiting families, just the grinding wheels against tarmac and the smell of burnt rubber in the air. Her unit filed out in silence, boots hitting the ground one after another, the sound almost rehearsed. She stepped off last, her rifle slung over her back, the weight as familiar as the ache in her shoulders. No one spoke to her, not directly. They glanced her way, nodded curtly, then themselves with gear or chatter. The distance wasn't new, but now it was sharper. In the mess hall that night, voices rose around her, laughter spilling over trays of food, of missions with exaggerated bravado. She sat at the end of a long table, her meal untouched. One soldier leaned toward another, just loud enough for her to hear. 3,000 meters, come on, no one pulls that off, it's a story, not a fact. The other shrugged, then why's the badge pinned on her? Symbol, that's all, they love a good myth. She pushed her tray away, appetite gone. Everywhere she went, the same murmur followed. Some didn't believe her. Others believed too much, like she was something unnatural, someone to fear. Neither gave her what she needed, understanding. At night, the silence of the barracks was no refuge. Sleep never came easy. The mountains returned in flashes, the frozen rock beneath her, the tremor in her hands, the way her chest had gone hollow after the shot. She'd jolt awake, breath shallow, her hands gripping the sheets like a trigger. She tried to train harder, to drown it out with exhaustion. Morning runs stretched into hours. She carried weights until her arms burned, pushed herself until her lungs screamed. The pain was grounding, but it wasn't escape. No matter how hard she drove herself, the silence followed. Some recruits approached her once, their tone casual but their eyes sharp. "Tell us about it," one said. "The shot." She shook her head. "No." "Come on, just the details. What scope did you use? How'd you factor wind at that distance?" I said no. They left with smirks, whispering as they went. To them, her silence was arrogance. To her, it was survival. Because once she spoke of it, once she gave it life outside her own mind, she feared it would consume her. The one instructor who had once seen her, the veteran, crossed paths with her again. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He just studied her for a moment, then said softly, "The further the shot, the heavier it lands." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The days dragged. Promotions passed her by, handed to louder voices, to those who thrived in the noise of recognition. She didn't complain. She had never sought rank. But in the quiet corners of her mind, doubt returned. Had the shot defined her, or had it trapped her? One evening she found herself in the armory, the spread open across the table. Her fingers traced the steel, not cleaning, not maintaining, just tracing. She wondered if the rifle remembered, if it too carried the weight. A fellow soldier walked in, froze, then backed out without a word. Later, she overheard him muttering in the hall, "She sits with that rifle like it's a shrine." The words stung. Not because they were untrue, but because they were too close to truth. She began to avoid the others. Meals taken alone. Training done at hours when the yard was empty. The silence she once wielded as armor had become a cage. And still the whispers persisted. "She's not like us. She's dangerous. She's broken." But none of them knew what broken really was. Broken wasn't the shot. Broken was the silence afterward, the echo of it, the knowledge that courage and regret sometimes looked the same when you held them in your chest. One night, sitting under the dim light of the barracks lamp, she caught her reflection in the window. The badge gleamed faintly against her chest, the number etched clear. She stared at it for a long time, her throat tight. Was it honor, or was it a scar? She thought of the general, though she had not yet met him then. Of what kind of man could understand what numbers on steel truly meant. Somewhere deep down, she hoped someone would. But until then, she would carry it alone. And the burden grew heavier with every passing day. Why did the general stop walking? His boots had carried him across deserts and jungles, across parade fields and battlefields. He had learned long ago that rhythm was everything. Step after step, steady and unbroken. That was how a leader moved. Soldiers read meaning in every pause, every shift of breath. And so, for decades, he had mastered the art of never faltering. Until now. The training yard stretched silent before him, recruits lined up stiff and nervous under the fatting sun. He moved down the line with deliberate calm, medals glittering against his chest. He wasn't a man who enjoyed ceremony, but he knew the power of presence. His eyes scanned each face quickly, searching for discipline, for bearing. And then he saw her. At first just another uniform, small in stature, quiet in demeanor, nothing that demanded attention. But then the badge. He almost missed it, just a faint glint of steel on her chest, but the number caught his eye. 3,200 meters. His step broke, his body froze. The gravel beneath his boot gave way with a crunch that hung louder than a rifle crack. He stared, not at the girl, not even at the rifle slung over her shoulder, but at that small, merciless inscription. He had seen badges before, dozens of marks of qualification, honors earned through repetition, through practice. But this one was different. This one carried the impossible. For a moment, he wasn't in the yard anymore. He was in the mountains. Different mountains years earlier. A mission gone wrong. His men pinned down, enemy fire sweeping across ridges like scythes. He remembered the sound of a rifle that saved them, a shot he never saw, a shooter he never met. Just the aftermath, silence where there had been chaos. Even then he'd known. Somewhere out there, someone had pulled off the impossible. Someone had lived with that weight. And now, years later, he saw her standing before him, small and quiet, carrying the proof on her chest. He felt something stir, something that caught him off guard. Not awe, not even pride, something heavier, recognition. Because he knew what that badge meant. He knew the silence it carried. The recruits didn't. They only saw a number, a myth, a curiosity. Some whispered, scoffing under their breath. Others widened their eyes, caught between disbelief and envy. But the general, he saw the burden. Her eyes stayed forward, unblinking, but he noticed the flicker at the corner, the faint tightening of her jaw. She expected judgment. She braced for it. He thought of the soldiers he had commanded, the loud ones, the fearless ones, the ones who shouted their courage into the world. Most of them burned out. Some didn't come back. But the ones who lasted, they were always the quiet ones, the ones who carried scars without showing them, the ones who understood that strength wasn't noise, it was silence. His voice came low at first, almost a whisper, not meant for the crowd but for himself. 3,200. The air shifted, recruits stiffened, a ripple passed through the line. Some laughed, disbelief dripping from their throats. Impossible. No way. She couldn't. But others saw his face, saw the gravity in his expression, and their laughter died in their chests. She didn't move, didn't speak. And in that silence, he saw it all, the nights in the mountains, the weight of the rifle against frozen hands, the moment when noise ceased and burden began. His hand twitched, hovering toward the badge. He wanted to touch it, not to confirm its reality, but to acknowledge it. But he stopped. Some burdens weren't meant to be touched. Some honors weren't about ceremony. Instead, he turned to the recruits. His voice carried now, steady and commanding, the kind of voice that didn't just speak. It carved truth into stone. You measure strength, he said, by noise, by who shouts the loudest, by who carries the heaviest pack, but real strength. He gestured toward her. Is carried in silence, in stillness, in choices no one ever wants to make. The yard shifted again, this time into something deeper. No laughter now, no whispers, just silence raw and heavy as if the air itself had bowed in recognition. She lowered her gaze, unsure. Was this praise, or was this another form of judgment? She couldn't tell. And then he saluted. Slow, deliberate, unwavering. It wasn't for show, it wasn't formality. It was respect, plain and unshakable. The recruits erupted, their applause sudden, uncoordinated, almost desperate. They clapped not because they understood her story, most never would, but because they felt the weight of the moment. For her the sound was deafening. For years she had lived in silence. Now noise crashed over her, a tide of recognition she had never asked for. Her chest ached. The badge felt heavier than ever. The general's eyes softened just for a second and she realized something. He knew. Not the details, not the night wind or the recoil or the silence afterward, but he knew enough. And in that fleeting recognition, she felt less alone. Not whole, not healed, but less alone. And sometimes, in the life of a soldier, that was all there was to hope for. Why did his salute hurt more than the whispers ever did? The yard had erupted around her, clapping hands, boots stomping against gravel, voices rising in thunder she had never heard before. For years, she had trained herself to move through silence, to survive in it, to almost disappear inside it. Now she was drowning in noise. And it wasn't relief, it was something sharper. The general's hand still lingered in her memory, raised in deliberate respect, a gesture she had never thought would be hers. For the recruits, it was a spectacle, a story they'd carry into late-night barracks chatter. For her, it was a fracture. Because recognition didn't erase the silence she had lived with. It only reminded her how much of it there had been. That night, alone in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling. The applause echoed in her ears, but so did the mountains, the wind, the impossible shot. Her chest felt heavy, as if the badge pin there had grown into something physical, pressing down on her ribs until she struggled to breathe. She turned onto her side, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories returned, the moments no one saw. The night after the shot, when she had sat alone, hands trembling so violently she couldn't even light a match for warmth. She had pressed her palms against her thighs, desperate to stop the shaking. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something emptier, something colder. She remembered writing a letter she never sent, to her father. The words blurred even as she wrote them. I did what they trained me to do, but I don't know if I can live with it. She tore the page before dawn, burning it piece by piece, watching the ashes scatter into wind that carried nothing back. She remembered training runs where her legs had buckled, where the thought of simply not standing up again had felt like relief. She had always stood anyway, but not out of strength, out of habit, because silence demanded she endure, even when she wasn't sure she wanted to. And she remembered the faces. Not the target, she had never seen him clearly, just a speck in the scope. But the faces of her unit afterward, eyes shifting away from her, lips pressed tight, unable to look at the one who had done what none of them could. She had carried their survival, but also their discomfort. That was the price. Survival had weight, and it was never distributed equally. The general's salute had cracked something open. She realized, maybe for the first time, that part of her had wanted recognition. Not the kind that came with medals or reports, but the kind that whispered, I see you. I know what it cost. And now that she'd felt a flicker of it, everything else seemed emptier. The whispers of doubt from the recruits didn't sting anymore. They barely touched her. What hurt now was the truth that even recognition couldn't erase the silence inside her. She rose from her bunk before dawn, boots slipping on the damp floor, and made her way outside. The yard was empty, the air cool and still. She stood in the center, rifle slung against her back, and let the quiet settle around her. This was where she belonged. in the spaces before the world woke, where no one was watching, where strength wasn't measured by applause. But even here the questions came. Had she broken somewhere along the way? Was her silence resilience, or was it just emptiness wearing armor? Her breath fogged in the morning chill. She closed her eyes. She thought of the soldier who had once told her, "You remind them of themselves." At the time, she hadn't understood, but now she wondered if the general's salute had been less about her and more about the part of himself he saw reflected in her. Maybe that was why it hurt, because it wasn't just her story. It was a cycle. One silent soldier after another, carrying burdens that applause could never lift. Later that day, during training, she moved like a shadow. Commands barked, rifles fired, boots pounded against dirt. She obeyed, efficient and precise, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing the salute, feeling the fracture it left behind. That night, alone again, she wrote another letter, this one not to send but to keep. It began simply, "If silence is strength, then why does it feel like it's killing me?" She folded the page, slid it into the small notebook she carried in her pack. She never intended anyone to read it, but writing it made her feel less like she was dissolving inside her own quiet. The general never spoke to her again after that day. He didn't need to. One gesture had said more than words could, but the recruits spoke. They always spoke. The whispers shifted now, less mocking, more uncertain. "Did you see how he looked at her? He respects her, that means something. Or it means she's dangerous." She ignored them, but sometimes when she lay awake at night, she caught herself wondering if they were right. Maybe she was dangerous. Not because of what she could do with a rifle, but because of what silence could do to her if she carried it too long. And yet, even in the weight of that thought, there was something else. Hope. Fragile, almost imperceptible, but real. Because if silence had broken her, then the general's salute had reminded her she wasn't completely invisible. And maybe, just maybe, the cracks weren't just fractures. Maybe they were openings. And through them, light could enter. Why did one salute feel heavier than 1,000 miles of silence? The applause had ended, the yard emptied, the dust settled. But the moment stayed. It lingered in her chest like an echo that refused to fade. She replayed it again and again, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't stop. The general's hand rising, the weight in his eyes, the silence before the recruits erupted. For everyone else it was a scene, a story to tell later, how the general, the unshakable man of steel, had stopped in his tracks for a soldier no one thought twice about. They would laugh, exaggerate, argue over details. The story would stretch, bend, turn into legend. But for her it wasn't a story, it was a wound. Not a wound of pain, but of release. For so long she had carried herself as if invisible, a shadow at the edge of ranks, present but unseen. To be saluted by the general, not as duty but as recognition, it cracked something open. She didn't know what to do with it. That night, whispers ran rampant in the barracks. Did you see her face? She didn't even smile. She must expected it. No, she looked shocked. Doesn't matter, the general saluted her, that's not nothing. She lay in her bunk, eyes closed, listening. The whispers no longer cut like they used to. They didn't sting. Instead, they washed over her, faint, meaningless. Because something had shifted. It wasn't that she believed she belonged now. Not fully. Not yet. But for the first time, she felt the possibility of belonging. And that was new. The next morning, drills resumed. The recruits moved through obstacle courses, rifles clutched, breaths ragged. She ran with them, climbed with them, crawled with them. Nothing in her movement had changed, but their eyes had. They didn't whisper as loudly. Some even glanced her way with something she'd never seen before, not envy, not suspicion, but curiosity, as if they were beginning to wonder what silence really hid. During weapons training, one recruit hesitated near her. His voice was awkward, low. Can you show me how you steady your grip? Mine keeps slipping." For a heartbeat, she almost didn't answer. She wasn't used to being asked. She wasn't used to being seen as someone worth asking. But she nodded, adjusted his stance, showed him how to anchor his elbow, how to breathe through the shot instead of against it. He tried again, and his grouping tightened. He smiled, "Thanks." The word struck harder than the recoil of a rifle, because it had been so long since she'd heard it directed at her without mockery. Step by step, the wall around her thinned, not demolished, never demolished, but thinner. Still, in the quiet of night, the memories didn't vanish. The mountains returned. The cold, the distance, the impossible shot. No recognition could erase it. No applause could lift it. She would always carry that silence. But now she carried it differently. Because the general's salute had done something she hadn't realized she needed. It had taken her burden and held it up to the light, not to glorify it, not to erase it, but to acknowledge it. And in that acknowledgement, she found space to breathe. The next time she walked into the yard, heads turned, but the looks were different now, not sharp with doubt, not heavy with suspicion, just different, a quiet respect. She didn't need it, she didn't ask for it, but she accepted it. During one drill, a recruit stumbled, his pack weighing him down, his knees buckling. Without hesitation, she moved beside him, slid her shoulder under his arm and steadied him until he found his footing again. He muttered a quiet thanks, embarrassed, but she only nodded. No one mocked him for needing help, not that time, because they had seen her do it. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but real. Late one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she sat alone on the edge of the range, the across her lap. She stared at the badge pinned to her chest, the numbers etched into steel, and for the first time she didn't feel only its weight. She felt its truth. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't shame. It was simply what it was, a choice made in silence, carried across distance, remembered in scars. She thought of the general again, of the way his eyes had softened just for a heartbeat when he looked at her, and she realized that his salute had been more than respect, it had been understanding. And understanding was rarer than any medal. The applause of recruits would fade, the whispers would return in different forms, but his salute would remain, etched not on her chest but in her memory, steady as the trigger pull that had defined her. She closed her eyes, the evening wind brushing against her face, and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, her breath didn't feel like survival. It felt like release. What remains when the applause fades? The yard grew quiet again in the days that followed. The general had left, returning to his duties, carrying with him the mystery of why he had stopped for her. The recruits went back to their drills, their laughter, their sweat-soaked routines. Life moved on. But something in her had shifted. She noticed it in small ways. The weight in her chest didn't feel as crushing. Her silence didn't feel as lonely. When others glanced at her, their eyes no longer slid away in dismissal. They lingered just long enough to admit what they hadn't before, that she was more than they believed. And yet, when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a hero. She didn't see a legend. She didn't even see what the badge promised. She saw a girl who had been broken and rebuilt by silence. A girl who had carried whispers until they became armor. A girl who had taken a shot no one else would dare attempt, and then lived with the echo no one else could bear. A girl who had been saluted not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't, because she carried the weight anyway. The recruits would tell their stories. Years later, they'd exaggerate how the general froze, how the applause thundered, how the moment belonged to all of them. That was fine. Let them tell it. Her story wasn't for them. It was for the silence. She walked the range one evening, the heavy across her back, the horizon bleeding orange and gold. Each step echoed with memories, the march through sleet, the shot across valleys, the whispers that tried to erase her. She carried them all, not as wounds, not as pride, but simply as truths. Some truths live in noise, Others live in silence. Hers lived in both. She thought of the general again. How his hand had risen not because of protocol, but because he had seen something most never did. Not the badge, not the number etched into steel, but the weight behind it. And she wondered how many others walked silently with burdens like hers. Soldiers, yes, but also people who had made choices in the quiet, choices no one celebrated, choices that saved others but themselves. Maybe the salute hadn't been for her alone. Maybe it had been for all of them. The thought settled in her like warmth, fragile but steady. That night she sat with her notebook again, the one where she had written words she never showed anyone. She opened to a blank page, the pen trembling in her fingers, and wrote slowly. Silence is not emptiness, it is weight, and sometimes it is the only proof of courage. She closed the book, pressing her hand against the cover, and let the words sink into her. Outside, the yard was alive with noise, recruits shouting, boots striking gravel, rifles cracking through drills. She listened but didn't join. She didn't need to. Her place wasn't in the noise. It was in the quiet spaces that shaped everything else. The general's salute had reminded her of that. The recruits' applause had confirmed it, but deep down she had always known. Courage isn't always about standing taller than the rest. Sometimes it's about standing at all, even when no one sees you, even when silence is the only companion. She rose from her bunk, the badge glinting faintly against her chest, and stepped outside into the cooling air. The sky stretched wide above her, endless and indifferent, and yet, for the first time in years, she didn't feel small beneath it. She felt steady. Not whole, not unscarred, but steady. She thought back to that impossible shot, 3,200 meters of wind, doubt, and silence. She remembered how steady her hands had become when it mattered most. And she realized that wasn't just the shot, that was her. Steady in silence, unseen but unshaken. The recruits might forget the moment in time. The general might never speak of it again, but she would carry it, not as a burden but as proof. Proof that sometimes the quietest warrior is the one who changes the room. Proof that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers steady as a trigger pull across miles of doubt. She breathed deeply, the evening air filling her lungs, and closed her eyes. For once, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like freedom. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.